I spend most of my days looking after my grandmother, who's been battling Alzheimer's for a while now. It's been taking more from her each day, little by little. Now, I'm not a nurse, nor do I know much about medical care. A nurse stops by twice a week to handle that side of things. My only medical knowledge comes from a CPR course I took a few months ago, just in case something happens. But honestly, I feel like I'm already starting to forget the basics. I don't mind taking care of her, though. When I was 11, after my parents split up, my grandma stepped in to raise me. Neither of them wanted me, really. That became clear from the start. My mom probably loved me, but she wasn't cut out to be a mom. She knew that herself. My dad, on the other hand, was never meant to be around kids, let alone take care of one. He was always in and out of jail. Before I moved in with my grandma, some of my best memories were of those times when my dad was locked up. Things weren't perfect, but they were easier when it was just me and my mom. Every time my dad got out of jail, though, it felt like everything fell apart again. By the time my parents got divorced, I was about as heartbroken as a kid could be. The innocence of childhood was gone by then. But then I went to live with my grandma, and that all changed. Her house was big and clean with a nice plot of land. I had my own room and enough clothes to last a while. I thought we must have been rich. Raising me was a financial strain on her, but she never let it show. She always had that smile on her face. I really wish I could see it again. These days, ever since Alzheimer's took hold, she mostly just stares. On the good days, I get to care for her, and we spend time together reading books or watching her old black and white TV shows. On the bad days, though, she doesn't want any help at all. I never know what triggers it, but sometimes she wakes up scared and paranoid. Day 1, Sunday. My alarm went off at 5:55 a.m. What the heck? I thought. I set it for 9 o'clock. Most old folks like to wake up early, but my grandma could sleep all day if I let her. My usual routine starts at 9 o'clock. I get ready, make breakfast, and wake her up around 10 o'clock. So why was my alarm going off at 5:55? I turned it off and tried to fall back asleep. But before I could, I heard a crash from upstairs. I live in the basement, and Grandma stays on the main floor. I jumped out of bed and raced up the stairs. Was she okay? Did she fall? Why was she out of bed? My mind was racing. When I got to the top, I expected to see her on the floor, but instead, I found an empty living room. The sun hadn't come up yet, so it was still pretty dark in there. I peeked into her bedroom, and there she was, fast asleep. I quietly closed the door, relieved she was safe in bed. But I couldn't shake the thought of what caused that noise. So I checked around the house. The kitchen looked normal, except for a knife in the sink that I was sure I'd cleaned up the night before. Next, I checked the living room and noticed a book on the floor. I keep the place pretty neat, so I knew it was out of place. I picked it up and saw it was one of Grandma's old scrapbooks. This one was full of pictures of my mom when she was younger. I closed the book and put it back on the shelf, right where it usually sat. I still felt groggy, and I convinced myself that Grandma must have been looking at it earlier and left it on the floor without me noticing. It's funny how we'll rationalize things that don't make sense. Remembering I still had a couple of hours before my day really started, I sneaked out for a quick run. I don't usually leave Grandma alone, but she wouldn't wake up for a while, and I figured it would be nice to have a little time to myself. I came back half an hour later. When I walked into the bathroom, I got a text from my girlfriend, Jane. She works at a bakery and always texts me before she heads out, though I usually don't reply right away because, well, I'm never up this early. Her text said, "Good morning, Paul. I'm heading to work, but maybe I can stop by later and hang out." I smiled and decided to surprise her by texting back immediately, "Have a great day at work. Love you." "Wow, you're up early," she replied. "Yeah." A loud noise woke me up, so I decided to start my day early. I texted back, leaving out the part about my alarm being off by 3 hours. When it was time to wake up Grandma, I went into her room quietly and turned on the light. But when I saw her sitting at the foot of the bed, she wasn't looking at me with her usual blank stare. She had this fearful look in her eyes. "Hey, Grandma, what's wrong?" I asked. She didn't say a word. She just kept staring at me. I decided to give her some space, making sure she was safe before I left her alone. I went to the kitchen to make breakfast. As I glanced into the sink, the knife I had seen earlier was gone. I figured I must have been mistaken when I saw it earlier. There's a window above the kitchen sink that gives a nice view of the yard. As I stood there, a bluebird flew by and landed on the porch. It looked out of place, almost too bright and pretty for our little backyard. I'd never seen a bird like that around here before. When I turned around, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Grandma was right there, just inches from my face. "Geez, Grandma." I couldn't help but laugh, even though I was still a bit shaken. "You nearly scared me to death. Are you feeling any better?" But she didn't crack a smile. Her face was still filled with that look of fear and anger. It was almost like, "Hey, Grandma," I said, unsure. "You know who I am, right? It's me, Paul, your grandson." Without breaking eye contact, she whispered, "There's someone in the house." I felt a heavy weight of guilt and anxiety settle in my chest. I tried to reassure her. "No, Grandma, you know me. I live here with you, remember?" But her expression shifted from anger to one of disappointment. She leaned even closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper, and said, "No, Paul, I know who you are. I'm telling you there's someone in this house." My heart sank, and an icy feeling of dread spread through me. "Where? Grandma? Where did you see them? Are they still here?" I didn't hesitate for a second. I always believed her. But then a thought crossed my mind. Is this just the disease? Is she seeing things now? I couldn't remember the doctor mentioning hallucinations. I shook the thought away and grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but before I could unlock it, Grandma's hand gently rested on mine. "He's in my room," she said, almost like it was an afterthought. My pulse raced, and without thinking, I lifted her up and shuffled her toward the front door. Once we were outside, I sat her on the porch bench. "Stay here," I told her. She didn't look me in the eyes. I dashed back inside and made my way to her bedroom. The door was shut tight. I reached for the handle, but then I hesitated. My adrenaline had carried me this far, but now that it was time to check things out, it felt like it was running low. What would I even do if someone was in there? But I had to make sure we were safe. I turned the knob slowly and stepped inside. The room looked normal except for a bit of clutter. Didn't I clean in here last night? I searched every corner, but there was no sign of anyone. Relief washed over me for a second, but that faded when I remembered the master bathroom. Its door was still closed. I flung it open, but what I saw didn't scare me. It confused me. The entire bathroom, walls, mirror, and floor, was covered in a thick, black sludge. The smell hit me right away. It reminded me of long summer days walking down an empty road as a kid. It was the scent of tar and tobacco. I stood there for what felt like minutes, just frozen in shock, before I started checking the rest of the house. But there was nothing else out of place. I went back outside, finding Grandma still sitting on the bench, staring at a small pile of ants on the concrete. "Hey, Grandma, I checked the house. No one's there," I said. She didn't respond. "Did something happen in the bathroom? What is all that stuff in there?" Still no reply. I wasn't fully convinced that there had been an intruder, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that Grandma hadn't made that mess herself. The rest of the day dragged on. Grandma hadn't said a word since that moment, but honestly, I was so caught up in everything else that I didn't really have time to talk. Cleaning that sludge took me most of the afternoon. The tar was warm when I first touched it but soon dried, becoming hard and tough, making it almost impossible to remove. I didn't even notice how late it had gotten until I heard a knock at the door. "Jane." I hurried to answer, and when I opened it, I saw her face light up with a smile. "Jane, I'm so sorry. I forgot you were coming." She seemed a little disappointed. "Oh no. Do you want me to leave? I should have texted to remind you." "No, please come in. I'm just sorry." I've been so wrapped up in everything today. I haven't even showered or done anything. How's Grandma doing? She asked, concern in her voice. It's been a rough day for her, I said. She knew exactly what I meant. Over time, I'd confided in her about the tough days when Grandma was quiet and distant, when her mind wasn't fully there. Ah, poor Granny, she said, giving Grandma a sympathetic look. She really did care about her. We ordered Chinese food, and as we ate, I told Jane about everything that had happened. That's so weird, she said, taking a bite of orange chicken. Do you think she got the black stuff all over the bathroom herself? I honestly don't know. I'm not even sure it was her. I mean, maybe someone was in the house. I did notice a few things out of place. We sat in silence for a few moments, then turned our attention to a black and white film we had put on for Grandma. The night settled into a familiar rhythm. When the movie ended, I tucked Grandma into bed and Jane and I sat down on the couch, putting on a show with some color, cuddling as we relaxed. Day 2, Monday. The next morning, my alarm went off at 5:55 a.m. again. I checked my phone, still confused as to why it was happening 2 days in a row. Before I could try to fall back asleep, a loud bang from upstairs made my heart race. I was up in an instant. The sound was much louder than the one from yesterday. I rushed up the stairs and peeked into Grandma's room. She was asleep. Stepping back into the living room, I found the same scrapbook on the floor. I turned on every light in the room and opened the scrapbook. A chill ran through me as I flipped through the pages. Every photo with my mom in it had been ruined, her face cut out of each one. I called the police, and they assured me they'd be there soon. I was certain someone had been in the house. While waiting for them to arrive, I woke Grandma up and took her outside to my car. She sat there while I went over the house. In the 6 minutes it took for the police to get here, I noticed a drawer in the kitchen left open and found more of that black goo in the garage. The police conducted a thorough search of the house, checking every nook and cranny where someone might hide. They didn't find anyone, and there was no sign of forced entry. Seems like someone might have a vendetta against your mom, one of the officers remarked, noticing the photos of my mother with her face cut out. Well, if they were after her, they've got the wrong house, I replied. We haven't seen her in nearly 17 years. The officers reassured me that they'd check back later that evening to make sure everything was quiet and advised me to call if anything else unusual happened. Thanks, officers, I said, guiding Grandma back inside as they pulled out of the driveway. You okay, Grandma? I asked as we stepped inside. She didn't respond. I helped her onto the couch, but just as I was settling her in, something caught my eye. I turned toward the kitchen window, and there it was again, the bluebird from the day before. The bird was beautiful, its feathers almost glowing in the fading light, but looking at it, I felt an unsettling chill, as if something bad was waiting just around the corner. It stared at me for a moment longer before flying off into the dusk. The rest of the day dragged on. Grandma didn't say a word, not a single glance in my direction. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, I knew it was time to help Grandma to bed. I assisted her into her room, and as I made sure she was comfortable, she finally looked at me. I smiled at her, relieved to see some acknowledgement. But her face remained grim. She whispered, "Someone is in the kitchen." A cold wave of fear washed over me. What? Grandma, we were just in there. I didn't see anyone. Her face looked stricken with terror, and my words seemed to offer no comfort. She repeated, her voice trembling, "In the kitchen. The kitchen. Kitchen." Then, as if drained, she rolled over, closed her eyes, and stopped speaking. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Was it the illness talking? Or was something truly wrong? I stepped out of her room and made my way to the kitchen. At first glance, everything appeared normal. But then I noticed something odd. The drawer, the one where we kept the bags and wraps, was open again. I walked toward it, turned to leave, and flicked the light switch off, but the room didn't darken. I flicked the switch on and off again, but the light remained, and it was getting brighter. Panic shot through me. My mind raced. I reached for the knife block but froze. The block was empty. My stomach dropped as I looked to the sink and saw every knife laid out. Sharp, glinting, and waiting. The light intensified, growing brighter and brighter with every passing second. I panicked and grabbed for one of the smaller knives. As I did, I sliced my hand open, the sharp pain snapping me into focus. Blood dripped onto the floor, but I didn't have time to think about it. I grabbed the bread knife, my pulse thundering in my ears. I briefly glanced at my bloody hand, wrapping a cloth around it as I struggled to catch my breath. But then, everything went silent. The light that had been blinding me suddenly dimmed, and I saw it. A figure, a towering, monstrous shape at least 8 feet tall. It was naked, except for a layer of plastic wrap that covered it from head to toe. The light surrounding it was almost hypnotic, blurring the edges of my vision and distorting my surroundings. I couldn't make out its face, just a faint protrusion where its nose should be, hidden beneath the thin, slick layer of plastic. Fear rooted me to the spot. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. My body felt heavy and stiff, like I was trapped in molasses. I dropped the knife, and it clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the silence. I wanted to run, but my legs were like lead. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. Just as I thought it might lunge at me, it spoke. "Fear not, sweet boy." The voice was frail, weak, almost pleading, like an elderly person trying to comfort a frightened child. "Sweet Paul, sweet Paul." My breath caught in my throat. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible. "Sweet Paul, I am your guardian angel, your guide in the darkness, your friend from above." The voice echoed in my mind, but I wasn't convinced. An angel? This thing looked far more demonic, straight out of a nightmare. "Okay, well, I'm actually good. I don't need a guardian angel," I stammered, my voice shaky. The creature's breathing grew heavier, and its tone shifted to something far deeper, more menacing. "Yes, my sweet boy, you do." And then, without warning, the knives in the sink shot up into the air and lodged themselves into the ceiling. The noise sent a surge of panic through me, and I whipped around to look. As my eyes flicked away from the creature, I heard footsteps. Rapid, approaching footsteps. I screamed, turning back to face the monster. My arms instinctively raised to shield myself, and I braced for impact. But nothing came. I blinked, and suddenly, the room was dark and empty. The creature was gone. I was alone, standing in a quiet kitchen. My heart raced as I scrambled for the light switch and grabbed my phone, dialing Jane's number. It went straight to voicemail. She must be asleep, I thought, my pulse still racing. With no one to talk to, I paced restlessly around the house, the weight of the night's events pressing down on me. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I stumbled into bed, hoping for some respite. Day 3, Tuesday. My alarm blared at 5:55 a.m. This time I was ready, no longer startled by the noises or the creatures. I jumped up, determined to catch whatever had been haunting us. My first stop was Grandma's room. She was asleep. That was good, I thought as I gently closed the door behind me. I had to check the rest of the house. The scrapbook was the first thing I noticed, its pages ripped out and scattered across the floor. I winced at the sight. Grandma would be devastated if she saw her photo album like this. But I couldn't focus on it now. I needed to finish my search. Next, I checked the kitchen. Everything seemed normal except for one thing. The knife that had been stuck in the ceiling was still there. The others had fallen, but this one remained lodged firmly in place. I was about to investigate further when I heard a loud slam from the basement. The noise was much louder than anything from the previous days. It had to have woken Grandma. I quickly turned around to check on her just to make sure. As expected, she was sitting up in bed, staring blankly at the wall. "You okay, Grandma?" I asked, expecting no answer, But to my surprise, she responded immediately. "It's okay, Paul. They can't hurt us today. Hank will protect us." My heart skipped. Hank. My grandfather, who had passed away over 20 years ago. I couldn't bear to remind her of that, so I said nothing. Instead, I moved toward the stairs. The banging noise came again, louder this time, rattling the very foundation of the house. I froze. Then, gathering every ounce of courage, I descended to the basement. There were 2 rooms downstairs, a guest bedroom and a family room, which I had slowly turned into my personal man cave over the years. The noise came a 3rd time, and this time it was unmistakably coming from the family room. I crept up to the door and peered inside. The sight that greeted me wasn't what I expected. I'd anticipated seeing my so-called guardian angel, but what I saw was far worse. It was bigger than the angel, at least 10 feet tall, its body hunched awkwardly to fit inside the room. Unlike the angel's blinding light, this creature radiated an intense, oppressive darkness that seemed to fight against the soft glow of the moonlight coming through the window. Its hands were grotesquely large, the fingers long and bony, like something out of a fever dream. But the most disturbing thing was the black sludge that covered its entire body. It was dripping onto the floor in thick, greasy streams, and the smell, burning chemical, was unbearable. I fought the urge to gag as I stood frozen, trying to steady my breath. I shifted my weight, preparing to take another look. But before I could, the creature let out a bone-chilling scream, a horrible mix of a man's cry and a dog's howl. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the top of the stairs, nearly sprinting toward the front door, but I remembered Grandma. She was still in her room. I couldn't leave her alone. I dashed for the kitchen, crouching behind the island, trying to make as little noise as possible. I heard the creature's heavy footsteps following me, but it paused at the top of the stairs. It didn't know where I was yet, but I could hear it sniffing around, searching for me. Then, I caught a glimpse of it as its back was turned. The creature was carrying something large, something strange. At first, I thought it was a rug, but as it came closer, I realized it was my rug, the one from under my coffee table. What the hell does it want with that? As I scanned the kitchen for anything that could be used as a weapon, my eyes fixed on the window. And there, perched outside on the sill, was the same little bluebird. Just then, I heard a loud crash, followed by the sound of something hitting the floor. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the creature was gone. My rug, however, was now rolled up neatly in the living room. The rest of the day felt strange, like I was walking through a fog. My head throbbed relentlessly. No amount of acetaminophen could seem to dull the pain. Grandma stayed locked away in her room, only letting me in when it was time for her meals or medication. I had hoped to spend some time with her, but she was still lost in her own world. By the time night fell, I was ready to collapse into bed. But then, Jane showed up for dinner, and her infectious energy soon started to bring me back to life. "So, what did you do today? Find any more objects in weird places?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. I almost forgot that I hadn't told her about the bizarre monsters I'd been seeing. I considered keeping it to myself, but Jane was the one person I could never lie to. We'd been friends since elementary school and a couple since high school. She was the one person I could trust to believe my story. I told her about the tar monster and the plastic angel, recounting every detail as best I could. When I finished, Jane stared at me with her mouth hanging open. "Oh my goodness, Paul. This is just like that show Ghost Adventures or something." She was smiling ear to ear, clearly excited. Maybe not just like Ghost Adventures, but it's definitely freaky," I said, unsure how to respond. "We should set up cameras. We could catch them next time they show up. Maybe we'll even get famous." Jane's excitement was contagious, her enthusiasm completely out of place with the terrifying situation. "Yeah, I'd like to see how excited you are when one of them shows up in your kitchen," I teased, finally smiling myself. Jane's face lit up. "It's okay, Paul. I'll stay the night to protect you. Don't you have work in the morning? I asked, half joking. Nope. We're closed tomorrow, silly, she replied, laughing. I didn't say it, but I was secretly relieved. I was terrified of spending another night alone. The thought of the creatures roaming the house made my skin crawl. Well, it's settled then, I said. You deal with the big evil monsters, and I'll get some much-needed beauty sleep. The rest of the night was surprisingly normal. We watched a horror movie. Of course, Jane picked it. What was it with her and this spooky stuff? And then went to bed. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was young again, around 7 or 8, helping my mom mop the kitchen floor. She showed me how to fill the bucket with water, then how much cleaner to pour in. She handed me the mop and said, "Give it a try." I was so eager to help that I almost tripped over the mop as I swished it back and forth. We were cleaning up something wet, and I assumed it was just a spill, maybe grape soda again. And then you dip it into the water, she told me. I dipped the mop into the bucket, ready to pull it back out, when I noticed something strange. The water was turning a light red color. Confused, I glanced down at the floor and froze. The liquid I had been mopping wasn't grape soda. It was blood. Thick, glistening blood, pooling on the floor. I screamed and looked up at my mom for comfort, but I stumbled backward, knocking over the bucket. As I fell, drenched in water, soap, and blood, I looked up to see my mother staring at me with the biggest, most unsettling smile. Blood was pouring from her head. I shot upright in bed, gasping for air. My heart raced, and I could barely catch my breath. Jane sat up immediately, rubbing my back. Hey, what's the matter?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and started to laugh a little, still shaken. I just had the weirdest, most messed up dream. I was a kid, and my mom was letting me help with chores, but she was bleeding everywhere, and I think she was going to die. Jane kept rubbing my back, still trying to comfort me. "That's really weird. Your mom's okay though, right? I mean, as far as we know." To be honest, I wasn't sure. The last time I saw my mom was before she went to rehab when I was 8. After that, we only communicated through letters. Then, when I was 13, the letters stopped. "I'm sure she's fine," I said, more to reassure myself than her. We both lay back down, and I managed to fall back asleep, but I didn't have any more dreams that night. Day 4, Wednesday. The alarm went off at 5:55 a.m., pulling Jane and me out of our restless sleep. "Why did you set the alarm so early?" Jane mumbled, pulling a pillow over her ears in an attempt to block out the sound. I silenced the alarm. "I didn't set it. It's been going off like that. You'll hear a loud noise, almost like banging, in a minute or two." We both fell into a tense silence, waiting for whatever might happen. 10 minutes passed, and I started to feel a glimmer of hope. "Maybe nothing will happen today," I muttered under my breath. Moments later, a scream tore through the house, coming from upstairs. "Granny!" Jane shouted, springing into action. I bolted up, stumbling on the stairs before catching myself and dropping to all fours. I crawled up the rest of the stairs with terrifying speed. When I reached Grandma's door, Jane was right behind me. I threw the door open and scanned the room. She was gone. I rushed to her bed, checking under it, but there was nothing. We frantically searched the room, then the closet, the bathroom, and even the kitchen. No sign of Grandma anywhere. She had vanished. "Call the police. I'm gonna drive around the neighborhood in case she left the house," I yelled, panic rising in my chest. Jane immediately dialed 911, and I heard her give the operator our address as I rushed out the door. I spent the next 15 minutes driving up and down every road near our house, but there was no sign of her. I couldn't help but feel that something was horribly wrong. Jane texted me to say the police had arrived, so I headed back to the house. The officers did another search of the house and spoke to someone on their radios, asking them to look out for an elderly woman who had wandered off. I told them about the scream, how terrified it sounded, and how I feared she'd been taken. They listened, taking notes, trying not to make me feel completely insane. When I finished telling my story, they said the most likely scenario was that Grandma had left the house on her own. I didn't argue. I knew how absurd it must have sounded, and honestly, I hoped they were right. If she had just left the house, as dangerous as it was, that would be easier to handle than the thought of her being taken. The officers left to search the area. As they drove away, I held Jane close as she cried into my shirt. The rest of the day was a blur of driving and searching. Jane and I took turns combing through town, looking for any sign of Grandma. When we couldn't keep going, we'd head back to the house and search again, but we found nothing. The cycle repeated until it got dark, and we finally decided to let the police do their job and try again tomorrow. We kept in contact with the officers throughout the day, but they had no luck. I was exhausted, devastated, and I wanted to break down, but I couldn't. I kept pushing my emotions aside, focusing on finding Grandma. I didn't have time to cry. Not yet. By the time we got back home, Jane had passed out on the couch, utterly spent. I stayed up, working on a flyer for tomorrow, hoping to spread the word around town. I kept my phone's ringer on, waiting for any updates from the police. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy, and my head drooped. I was seconds away from completely losing consciousness when a voice whispered, startling me awake. "You don't remember, do you, sweet boy?" I jolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The plastic angel's head was peeking from behind the sofa where Jane was sleeping. Its long, bony fingers curled around the back of the couch. Jane," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "Jane, wake up." I shook her, but she didn't stir. She was a heavy sleeper, but this was different. She should have woken up by now. "You need to remember." The angel's voice rang out, shrill and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. "Remember what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my entire body trembling in fear. "You need to remember, Paul. You were young. Your mind was easily molded." But it was not the truth. The plastic angel inched closer, its voice growing more insistent. "You need to see what you were forced to forget." When it reached my chair, the angel slowly raised its pointer finger, which began to glow with a brightness that was almost unbearable to look at. The light seared through my vision, and the tip of its finger landed on my forehead. I instantly fell into a deep sleep. 17 years ago, when I was 8, my parents fought constantly. One summer, after my father finished his 3rd stint in prison, he returned home to find that my mother had made some changes. She'd been spending less on pills and more on groceries. She even bought me new shoes and took me to the movies once. This change didn't sit well with my father. The arguments escalated, and I would find myself sitting outside our mobile home on the concrete slab, waiting for the yelling to end. One day, I sat in the sweltering sun, playing with a group of ants that had found a small splash of grape soda I'd spilled. I watched them crawl on my fingers before heading back to the hot ground. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. My parents' voices from inside became unbearable, so I stood up and started walking, not knowing where I was going, just wanting to be anywhere else. After wandering for what felt like a lifetime, I spotted a girl sitting on a tire swing hanging from a solitary tree. I tried not to make eye contact because, at 8, girls were still icky. As I walked past, she called out, "Hey kid!" I turned, startled, and saw her grinning, her smile wide and warm.
Iraplia, Shapishli.
"Could you push me? I'm not very good at pumping my legs." I hesitated for a moment. It felt a little strange, but I didn't have anything else to do. Pushing her on the swing seemed more interesting than walking aimlessly. "What's your name?" she asked, as I began to push her gently. "Paul," I said, starting to relax. "What's yours?" "Jane," she said matter-of-factly. We played for about an hour, and as I glanced at the sky, I realized it was probably time to head back. My parents didn't like it when I was gone for too long. From then on, whenever my parents fought, I would walk over to Jane's house, and we'd take turns pushing each other on the old tire swing. One particularly rainy day, the fighting reached a new level. I pulled on my rain boots and was heading to my room to grab my coat, thinking Jane and I could find some big puddles to splash in. But as I walked past the kitchen, I heard my mother scream. It wasn't an angry scream. It wasn't even a scream of fear. It was the scream of someone in pain. I rushed into the kitchen to find my mother clutching her face, which was quickly bruising. My father stood over her, his rage evident in every line of his face. I froze, my feet rooted to the floor, unable to move. I looked at my mother, then at my father, my heart pounding in my chest. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of my parents shouting blurring into background noise. My dad looked at me and shouted, "You see, Paul, this is what happens when you step out of line." I was paralyzed. I wanted to help my mother. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay. I wanted to hurt my father for hurting her. But most of all, I wanted to scream. I wanted to scream so badly, but I couldn't. All that came out was a sob. My crying only made my father angrier. He took a step toward me, but my mother shot up off the ground like lightning and lashed out, screaming, "Stay away from him, you monster!" My father shoved her aside and went to strike her again, but my lungs finally released the death grip they'd held on my breath, and I screamed, "Stop it!" This caught him off guard, and as he turned to face me, my mother jumped to her feet once more and rushed to the knife block, pulling out the largest knife. Before she could use it, my father grabbed her from behind and threw her down. Her head slammed against the counter on her way to the floor. With a sickening thud, she collapsed. She lay motionless as a pool of blood began to spread across the floor. "Oh shit!" my father yelled. He started grabbing at her head, a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "No, no, no, no!" His voice trailed off, and I watched, helpless, as the crimson stream flooded from my mother's skull. Time seemed to stop. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't dare say a word. Couldn't. There was nothing in my 8-year-old mind that could comprehend what had just happened. My mother never woke up. When my father finally composed himself, he stood up and began rummaging through the drawers in the kitchen. After what seemed like forever, he found what he was looking for. Dropping to his knees next to my mother, he grabbed a package of plastic wrap and lifted her head a few inches. Carefully, he wrapped the plastic around her head, sealing the wound as best he could. Once he was satisfied, my mother looked like a mannequin, shiny and lifeless. He laid her head back down and left the room, returning a moment later with the rug from under our coffee table. He wrapped her up tightly and, without looking at me, snapped, "Grab the mop." Soon I was cleaning the kitchen floor. I had to stand up and move out of his way as he dragged my mother's body through the front door. He locked the deadbolt behind him, and I heard the truck's ignition roar to life. I peered out the window, watching him drive away. He didn't come back for several hours. The entire time he was gone, I sat curled into a ball in my corner of the kitchen. The day turned to night, and eventually, I fell asleep on the cold kitchen tile. I awoke when he returned. His steps were slow, deliberate. I glanced at the digital clock on the stove. 5:55 a.m. He was sweaty, tired, and had a look of sadness etched into his face. He took a shower, dressed, and then called me into the living room. I shuffled in, my little feet dragging behind me. He was quiet for a long while, as if lost in his thoughts. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Polly, you know Mommy had to go away for a little while, right?" I looked at him, confused. He continued, "Mom has been fighting some tough battles these past few months. She used a lot of drugs. You know she uses drugs, don't you?" I nodded. I had seen her high, lying in bed for days, her face a hollow shell of what it once was. I didn't say anything, just listened as he thought for a moment before telling me. "Mom had to go somewhere to get help, a rehab center. It's kind of like a hospital." The more he spoke, the less I understood. "But she was bleeding. Where did you take her?" I felt more lost than ever. No, Paul, he said sternly. She wasn't bleeding. But you, I stammered.
No.
Paul, no, he shouted, his voice harsh. Mom is fine. She just had to go away for a while. His frustration was evident. She had to go away, he repeated. So when someone asks you where your mom is, what do you tell them? His gaze locked onto mine. I tell them she had to go away for a while. Yes, Paul, that's right, he said, burying my face in his chest as he forced an embrace. That's right, son. Mom just had to go away for a little while, and that's all we know. After he left the room, I stayed there, trembling. Eventually, I stood shakily and walked out the front door. I sat on the wet concrete slab, unsure of whether I should cry. I was so confused. I wanted to believe my father. If he were telling the truth, then my mother would be okay. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still loomed overhead. Just then, I heard a quiet tap on the concrete beside me. I turned my head to see the most beautiful blue bird, perched so still, it seemed almost reverent. I awoke drenched in sweat. I was back in the living room chair where I had been before the angel touched me. Jane was still curled up on the couch. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 5:50 a.m. Day 5, Thursday. When the alarm went off at 5:55 a.m., I silenced it and woke Jane up. What's going on? She asked, rubbing her eyes. We have to hide. This is when it always happens. Confused but terrified, she sat up and began looking around. Where should we hide? I was scared, but I managed to say, the pantry. We scrambled to the kitchen door and hid inside just before the booming sound echoed through the house. As we closed the door, a blood-curdling roar erupted from the basement. We held each other, terrified, not daring to breathe too loudly. The pounding of footsteps from upstairs seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Through the slits in the pantry door, I could see a large, dark figure launch itself from the top of the stairs and crash into the living room. Black sludge spilled onto the floor as the creature searched wildly, its eyes gleaming with fury. Carried the rug from the basement. This time it looked thicker, heavier. It slammed the rug onto the floor with a scream and fled down the stairs, skittering on all fours. When it was gone, we ventured out of the pantry, our breath coming in shallow gasps. I rushed to the living room. I had to see what was inside that rug. My gut told me it would be the decayed body of my mother. But when I opened it up, she wasn't inside. Instead, it was my grandmother, cold, still, lifeless. My heart shattered as I let out a sob. Tears streamed down my face as I desperately performed CPR. 30 chest compressions, 2 breaths. I remembered, but it wasn't enough. My grandmother, the woman who had raised me, the only stability I'd ever known, lay dead on the floor of our living room. At the funeral a few days later, Jane held me as we cried together. I had never felt death sting so deeply. It didn't just take a life, it took my whole heart. Could I really say that death took my grandmother? Or did it take the loss of the truth, the knowledge of what had happened? If I had remembered sooner, would any of this have happened? Would it have been different? Everything ended the night my grandmother was taken from me. As they lowered the casket, a small blue bird perched near the grave, bowing its head in reverence. Walking back to our car, Jane broke the silence. I haven't smoked in years, but I think I'll need a cigarette today. You want one? She pulled out a pack I didn't know she had. No thanks, I replied. My dad used to smoke 2 packs a day.